I know we'll still have a few people trickling in across the skyway out here, but hopefully folks will come in the back, and I want to make sure we have enough time for a discussion after our speaker. So very briefly, since I think most of you, although perhaps not all of you know me, my name is Brian Trainer. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm currently the director of the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination, which is a center on campus that tries to bring together faculty and students interested in research and sort of intellectual community around the center of gravity of what you might think of as the Catholic intellectual tradition, with a real emphasis on the fact that the Catholic intellectual tradition is not something you find just in philosophy and theology, but you also find in economics, in the sciences, in business, in the arts, and other things like that. So this particular event is being co-sponsored by the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination and the Political Science Department, appropriately. The Academy does a lot of co-sponsorship in this sort of way, and poli-sci has been great in terms of bringing out many of the students and other people on campus, so I appreciate that. I want to make a quick announcement about a couple of events that are coming up. I'm not going to display things up here, but all of these are on flyers on the table outside, and I hope you'll consider coming to them. Yes, that would be perfect. It would be an order of happening. So first, coming up on October 30th is the annual commemoration of Kristallnacht with the Jewish Studies program here at LMU. We've got an important speaker who has a book that's been very well reviewed and been getting a lot of press. Holly Levitsky, who runs Jewish Studies, has been instrumental in organizing that program. The Academy is co-sponsoring that as well. We've got a second event coming up in early November with Modern Languages and the Center for Lebanosian Studies, at which our own Paul Harris in the back row will be speaking. He's shrinking down. But that should be a great event. It's co-sponsored with the French Consul and the Alliance Française, Modern Languages, and ACTI. And then finally, a quick, somewhat longer word for the last big program ACTI is doing this semester, which is on the work of Jean Vanier and the L'Arche communities, where people like ourselves live in community with people with various degrees of disability. It's an incredibly profound vision of human vulnerability and humanity more generally. And so we are, on that day, on November 7th, going to show a film about Jean Vanier and his work called Summer in the Forest. After a short break, we're going to have a panel that consists of members of a L'Arche community, both the assistants that live there, which are people like yourself. In fact, the assistant we've got coming up is an LMU alumna, and some of the core members who are the members living in the community who themselves have various disabilities, and they're going to talk about their life together and their stories. So I hope that you'll look at these flyers on the way out, and that you'll tell all the freshmen you know they're required. They don't know any difference yet, right? Okay. Before I introduce our speaker, let me ask you to join me in the ritual turning off of the cell phones so that nothing happens. Those of you who've been to ACTI events know I'm pretty keen to try and keep it that way. All right. It's my great pleasure to invite here to speak David Campbell. He is the Packey J. Professor of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame and the chairperson of the Political Science Department. He's an expert on religion, politics, and civic engagement. He's regularly featured in the national media, in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, NPR. Lots of different news outlets have availed themselves of his expertise. He completed his undergraduate studies at BYU and his graduate studies at Harvard. He's the author or co-editor of 8 books and countless articles, including American Grace, How Religion Divides Us and Unites Us, which was widely lauded. America called it a, quote, instant classic, and the San Francisco Chronicle described it as the most successfully argued sociological study of American religion in more than half a century. American Grace received both the 2011 Woodrow Wilson Award from the American Political Science Association for the best book on government, politics, or international affairs, and the Wilbur Award from the Religious Communications Council for the best nonfiction book of 2010. Professor Campbell's other books include Why We Vote, How Schools and Communities Shape Our Civic Life, A Matter of Faith, Religion and the 2004 Presidential Election, Making Civics Count, Citizenship Education for a New Generation, and Seeking the Promised Land, Mormons and American Politics. I ask you to join me in not holding it against him that he is apparently also friends with our own John Parrish. But in any case, I've heard him speak myself in other venues where we've been part of the same conference, and I know that we're in for an informative and engaging presentation and discussion today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Campbell today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, which, by the way, breaks the very cardinal rule of politics, which is when you have an event, a political event, you always want to keep expectations low. So, looking out on the audience here today, given my topic, I'm reminded of a lecture I gave, and the date here is important, in October 2015 in Moscow. Not Moscow, Idaho, but in Russia. I was invited there to speak about, first, the role of religion in American politics, which I'll talk about today, but then also just a general lecture on how American presidential elections work. And the room was packed. It was a huge crowd, and I fear that I may have told them too much. So keep that in mind as we go through the presentation today. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation. As Brian mentioned, I actually have many connections to LMU, and it's been nice to spend some time on your campus today. However, I do have to acknowledge being in Los Angeles, that I am a Red Sox fan. I didn't think I should lead with that. I thought I should save that for the second slide. So we'll just leave that up for a few minutes. I'm not sure, how is the series going? I'm not sure. We'll see. I want to talk today a little bit, as the title suggests, about the role of religion in American politics. The title of the presentation references the midterm elections. However, what I'm not going to do today is try to forecast which party is going to win the House or the Senate, although I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Nor am I going to focus on any particular congressional race or any particular Senate race, although again, I'm happy to engage on those questions in the Q&A. Nor am I going to tell you how you should vote. Instead, what I hope to do today is to provide a bit of context for this election as we think about the role that religion currently plays in American politics, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about how it's played a role in the past, and perhaps also how it might play a role in the future. So to start, I would like to lay the groundwork by making the point that religion, or specifically involvement in a religious community, is a very powerful engine of civic engagement. So what I'm about to show you on the screen are a few pictures and bar charts. Now some people I know in audiences like this are picture people. You like the graphs. Some people hate graphs. If you're a picture person, you're going to love this talk. If you're not a picture person, don't worry. Every picture I put up on the screen, I'm going to explain fully. So hopefully you'll be able to close your eyes and still be able to follow the presentation as I go through the pictures. But what I'm going to show you are graphs that plot people's level of religiosity, which is just a $5 word to reflect measures of people's religious commitment, how frequently they attend religious services, how strongly they believe in God, and a variety of other things that have been compressed together in a single measure. And religiosity is going to be plotted with various measures of civic engagement. Let me just show you what I mean by that. So along this axis, we have how religious people are. People are either not so religious, they're on the secular end, or they're highly religious, they're on the more religious end. Oh, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry, new clicker. All right. The height of the bar on this particular graph shows you how many people in each of these categories. We split people into just 5 bins. The middle bin, people are sort of at an average level of religiosity. If you're at the top bin, number 5, you're at the highest level. Number 1, you're at the lowest level. Hopefully that all makes sense. And the height of the bar shows the percentage of people in each category who belong to 3 or more civic groups. And as you can see, the more religious somebody is, the more likely they are to belong to a group, an association. These are an important part of the civic fabric. Well, you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's interesting, but wouldn't we expect people who are engaged in a religion, which is a group of a sort, to also be involved in other sorts of groups, right? That's probably not too much of a surprise. Well, get used to this pattern, because I'm about to show you a whole series of pictures that look very similar. Now we're looking at how religiosity predicts whether or not you belong to not just an organization, but an organizing leadership group within that organization. If you're a committee member, for example. And you can see, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to do that. Here's whether or not you've attended any public meeting. Again, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to do that. Here's whether or not you are a member of a group that is targeted toward social or political reform. Same story. Here's whether or not you say you've worked with your neighbors to solve a community problem. Here's whether or not you vote in all or most local elections. Now I also know, because this is a skeptical bunch, I can tell, that some of you are sitting there and saying to yourself, well, we know that if you're involved in a religious community, you're probably just the sort of person who's more likely to get involved in this stuff. And maybe that has nothing to do with being religious. Maybe it has something to do with your age, or your level of education, or your gender, or a variety of demographic characteristics like that. Well, it turns out that every single one of these pictures controls for all of those other things in the background, which means we can isolate the impact of religiosity. We also find that people who are more religious are engaged in volunteering that we describe as both religious and secular. So again, we have people arrayed by how religious they are on the bottom of the screen. The blue bars are how involved people are in a form of volunteering that has a religious character. Maybe it's through a congregation, maybe it's not through a congregation, but it's through some other organization that has a religious character to it. The other bars, the orange-colored bars, they show the percentage of people who are involved in what we'll call secular volunteering, which is sort of every other type. So you've got volunteering through religious organizations, and then you have all sorts of other volunteering. And what do you find? Well, not surprisingly, people who are not very religious are not very likely to volunteer for a religious cause. That makes sense. And the more religious you are, the more likely you are to engage in religious volunteering. But what's perhaps more interesting about this graph is that those religious folks are also involved in secular volunteering at a pretty high rate. All of which suggests that religion is a very important component of America's civil society. That's important for us to keep in mind when we think about the political landscape. Because, as I showed you, these religious folks are not just engaged in apolitical volunteering, or getting together with their neighbors to solve a community problem in maybe a nonpartisan way. They're also involved in good old-fashioned politics. They vote. They belong to political groups. We don't actually have this on the screen, but we also know they show up for party meetings. They end up as delegates to political conventions, all those sorts of things. Now, this is important again for us to understand the American political landscape today. But as we look forward, as I'll show you in a few minutes, you'll see that America is becoming a less and less religious country, which some people, indeed I just came from a conference in Utah yesterday in which I did actually hear someone extrapolate from the fact that America is secularizing, and again I'll show you some more evidence on that in a minute, suggesting that that then therefore means that we would see less volunteering and less other forms of civic engagement. However, in work that I've been engaged in for the last few years, trying to understand not just the religious population, but also the secular population in the United States, we increasingly see evidence that it's not necessarily the case that this rising tide of secularism in the US will necessarily lead to a decay in our civic life. And the reason for that is it depends on what type of secular person we're talking about. There's one type, my colleagues and I call them passively secular. These are people who just aren't religious. They don't identify with a religion. They don't attend religious services. They might say that they don't believe in God, or at least they're kind of iffy on the God question. But they do not have what we call an actively secular worldview. They're just not something. If, however, you look at people who define themselves not just by what they are not, but also by what they are, these are people we call actively secular. So they might call themselves atheists, although that's still a relatively small fraction of the population. They're more likely to take on a label like humanist, or maybe even they may call themselves secularist. And then if you ask them questions about where they derive truth and meaning, they're often able to tell you, well, they come from these secular sources. And so if you look at that group of this population of the growing seculars within the United States, they are actually highly engaged in politics. So you have this very sharp divide between the passively secular people, who probably can fairly be described as civic dropouts, and these more actively secular people who are more likely to be engaged in politics. And the reason I mention that is it helps us understand what's going on with the religious community. Because there's actually a lot of debate among social scientists about just what it is that connects religion to civic life. And the research that I've done with Robert Putnam that was mentioned in the introduction, a book that we published a few years ago called American Grace, makes a great Christmas gift you should buy one for all of you. One of the things that we highlight in that book is our explanation for why it is that religious folks are highly engaged in civic life. And we find it's not actually the beliefs that they carry in their head or in their heart, but it's actually the communities that they form. The religious communities are a very powerful way that people are brought into civic life. The way this kind of works on the ground is that if you are in a religious community, a congregation of some sort, whether it be Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, Muslim, Mormon, whatever, and you have a group of tight-knit folks that you interact with on a regular basis, in this larger setting where there's a moral vocabulary, and somebody comes to you and says, would you like to help clean up this park? Would you like to participate in a blood drive? Would you be willing to give some time at the homeless shelter? It's a lot harder for you to say no than if you're being asked that question by a coworker. And in fact, it's often the case that the very thing you're being asked to do is going to be different in a religious context. Now, what that means is it's the religious communities that matter, the social networks that form, not so much the content of the beliefs within that religion. And so we actually get kind of comparable results for how religious you are and how civically engaged you are, whether we are looking at the Catholic population, the mainline Protestants, the Evangelicals, the Muslims, the Mormons, the Jews. It kind of works the same way. And it suggests that it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious community that drives people's civic activity, that other organizations, secular organizations, could possibly do the same thing. Now, those kinds of organizations are few and far between, because there are not very many secular groups, maybe none, that thus far have effectively replicated what it is that a church or a temple or a mosque does, which is typically bring people together on a weekly basis and have them hear a sermon and give them liturgy and have them participate in rituals that are very important for reinforcing an identity and, again, this moral vocabulary. But in theory, it could happen. And I suggest that we are poised at a moment in American history as we see, as I'll show you in a few minutes, this growth of secularism in the US, that we might very well see a turn where more and more secular folks come together and in turn become civically engaged together. Now, I'm just sort of putting that out there as an interesting thing to think about what may be happening as we go forward. But enough about speculation on the future. Let me talk a little bit about what's happened in the past and then what's happening in the present. So I've, up till now, talked about the kind of feel-good side of religion's involvement in the civic world, right? All these religious folks are going out there and they're volunteering, right? And they're working on the homeless shelters and they're working on the blood drives and they're cleaning up the parks and all that's great, right? Well, there's this other side to it that makes many Americans uncomfortable, which is that mixture of religion and politics, and specifically partisan politics. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes and take us through a little bit of American history to talk about how it is that religion and politics have interacted. I'm going to do so, again, with a few pictures. What you're looking at on the screen are the results of a question that the Gallup poll has asked going all the way back to the mid-1950s. The question that they've asked is, do you think that the influence of religion on American life is increasing or decreasing? Now this turns out to be a very, very useful barometer, if you will, a way of understanding what's going on in the larger social landscape, what's going on with religion in America. Because it turns out that people are really good at telling us what's going on with religion in the country at any given point in time. So I'm going to focus on these Gallup polls, again, because they're a good barometer, they're a good proxy for all sorts of other things that I can also show you, like measures of church attendance, or church construction, or publications and religious literature, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm basically asking you to trust me that this is a good way to sort of track this stuff over time. It's useful because it goes all the way back to the 1950s. And as you can see, that back in the mid-1950s, almost 70% of Americans said the role of religion in American life was increasing. And they were right. In fact, many historians argue that the 1950s were a high point of religious involvement in all of American history. So you've probably been led to believe that the story of religion in American history is that at the time of the founding, everybody was highly religious, and it's been downhill ever since, right? America's going to hell in a handbasket. But that actually is not true. Religion has ebbed and flowed. And the 1950s happened to be a high point, and some suggest it was the highest ever. Why? Well, there were multiple reasons. It was the baby boom, post-war era. All those GIs were coming home, getting married, moving to the suburbs, having kids. All those things predict people becoming involved in religion. The geopolitical environment mattered as well, because this was, of course, the beginning of the Cold War. America was facing off against an atheistic Soviet Union on the world stage. Going to church was a patriotic thing. Lots of things going on. And if I were giving this talk in 1955, it might have seemed as though America was going to continue to be this highly religious country. But as you can see on the chart, between 1955 and, we'll say, 1968, 69, 1970s, or through the period of the 60s, you see this very dramatic drop-off. So by the time we get to, say, 1968, and Gallup asks people, is the role of religion increasing or decreasing? Now they're saying it's decreasing. And they were right. Bob Putnam and I, in our book, call this the shock of the 1960s. And what happened in the period of the shock? Well, I could give you all sorts of highfalutin social sciencey terms, but it all boils down to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. With an emphasis on sex. Sexual mores changed dramatically in the 1960s. Now, was that a cause of people leaving religion? Was it an effect of people leaving religion? That's maybe not so clear, but certainly the two things were moving together. And so if I were giving this talk in 1968, it would have seemed as though, if you keep extrapolating, that America was on its way to becoming France. I'm so glad you laughed at that. I use that line back and forth, and sometimes it works. I used that line once at a talk I gave at Georgetown, and it was crickets. Because it turned out there was a guy in the audience who was actually from France, and he was pretty offended that I would make fun of the French. But as you can see, I'm happy to make fun of the Dodgers, and I'm happy to make fun of the French. These are the very strong positions I'm willing to take. But that's not what happened, because following that shock of the 1960s, we had what Putnam and I call the first aftershock. Sex, drugs, rock and roll led to a changing America. And there were many Americans who didn't like those changes. And so they began to move into a form of religion that had been around for a very long time, but nonetheless had this revival, if you will, a resurrection even, if I could say it that way, evangelical Christianity. Evangelicals as a group became more socially prominent. They actually began to grow in numbers, counteracting the loss of memberships that you saw in the mainline Protestants and also among Catholics. And at the same time, they also began to enter politics. And the movement that we know as the religious right was born. And so when Americans, through basically the early to mid-1970s all the way through to the late 1990s, were asked this question: do you think the role of religion is increasing or decreasing? Now, they were a little more likely than they had been to say that it's increasing. Now you can see, it never got back up to where it was in the 50s. No. But it certainly was no longer declining and was even going up. So if I were giving this talk in, say, 1988, it would have seemed as though America was just on its way to becoming an ever more religious country, and that eventually we would all be evangelicals. But that's also not what happened. Because beginning in about 1990-ish, I don't want to put too much weight on any given year, so we're talking late 1980s, early 1990s, somewhere in there, we begin to see a drop off. Increasingly, Americans said the role of religion was decreasing in American society. And that's the period we're in now, and that's what Putnam and I call the second aftershock. The shock of the 60s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The first aftershock, the rise of evangelical Christianity, including the religious right. The second aftershock is the reaction, I would suggest, to the religious right. Let me just show you a little more evidence of what I mean by the rising tide of secularism. So when people said that the role of religion was decreasing, they were reflecting what you see in this chart. Another of these beautiful pictures that I'm showing you. This one comes from the General Social Survey, thought to be the gold standard of national surveys. It's been done all the way back from the 1970s forward. What I'm showing you is the percentage of Americans who say they never attend religious services, they have no religious affiliation, or they don't believe in God. And in every case, you can see that there has been an increase. In fact, for those who say they never attend religious services, and those who never attend, or those who have no religious preference, that increase has been dramatic, and it starts at almost exactly the same point that those folks in the Gallup poll were telling us that the role of religion was decreasing. Now, non-belief in God is a slightly different story. We don't have measurement of that going back as far. You do see the same trend. It's upward, but it's not nearly as dramatic, and there's obviously a big gap between people who, for example, say they have no religion and people who say they don't believe in God. That's important to keep in mind, because those people who say they don't have any religion are not necessarily atheists. In fact, most of them are not atheists, and many of them are perfectly willing to say at least they're open to the possibility of God, or they believe in a God, they're just not really sure what the specifics are. So what it seems to be is a rejection of organized religion, not necessarily a walking away from religion altogether. But whatever you call it, however you want to describe it, clearly this is an important trend, and I would suggest that it's an example of secularization happening in American life. In fact, it's probably particularly relevant to note that while this chart shows you that going up to 2016, in the overall population, it's roughly about 22%. who say they have no religion. If we looked only at millennials, only at people under the age of 30, it's closer to 35%. And that's new. Young people have always been less religious than their parents. But even during that period of the shock, the 1960s, when people were turning away from religion, because now sex, drugs, and rock and roll was the theme of the day, they still held on to their religious identity. And many of them would come back to the religion of their parents. That's less and less the case. So this is a puzzle. What was going on here? Why? Why do we see this increase? Well, I've already hinted at it when I described this period as the second aftershock. There's a growing body of evidence, some from yours truly, but other social scientists as well, that has found that one of the key explanations for what's going on here is people look out at the world and see religion joined at the hip with partisan politics, specifically conservative politics in the Republican Party, and say to themselves, well, if that's what religion is not for me. They are, in effect, putting their politics ahead of their religion. They're saying, because I am a political liberal or moderate, I don't want to be thought of as religious. I don't want to describe myself that way. I don't want to think of it in my own head. Let me just give you some evidence of why it is that people might have what we call perhaps an allergic reaction to the religious right, by just showing you a few examples of what I mean, including a few campaign ads. We're going to see some of the greatest hits. But let me start with a picture. This goes all the way back to 2004, the Republican National Convention. $5 to anybody who can name who's in that picture. That's George Pataki, former governor of New York. Thank you very much. Brian, would you pay her $5 later on? Big acknowledgement. This is George Pataki speaking from the podium of the Republican National Convention. Now here's what I want you to note. If you look carefully, does it kind of sort of look like there might be a cross there? Yeah. So in 2004, I'm sitting in my office at Notre Dame, and I get a call from a reporter from the Associated Press who wanted my opinion on whether I thought the Republicans had subliminally embedded a cross on their podium to signal to voters that they are the party of religion. And I proceeded to tell this reporter that we didn't need to worry about whether that is or is not a cross, because this is a party that's not subtle about its use of religion. This is a party, this is true, during the 2004 Republican National Convention, on prime time, stopped the entire proceedings to have a prayer, a Christian prayer. This is not subtlety. And so I'm going on and I'm giving this very lengthy dissertation, much like I am now, and the reporter on the other end literally says to me, Professor, I just wanted to know, do you think it's a cross? Because apparently if you teach at Notre Dame, you are an expert on crosses. I wasn't sure which way the reporter was going with this story. Did he think it was a cross? Did he not? Didn't want to be made the fool. And so I hedged my bet. You can actually look this up. I hedged my bet and was quoted in the national press as saying, well, I'm not sure, but it certainly has cross-like properties. In that same election, 2004, the Republicans, you might remember, capitalized on opposition to same-sex marriage. It's a reflection of how things have changed in America, that was thought to be a winning issue in 2004. What you're looking at is a flyer, direct mail flyer, that was sent in the great state of Ohio to hundreds of thousands of homes, in which it says, Republicans believe in America. We're the only party that defends life and protects the unborn from partial birth abortion. We're the only party you can trust to defend traditional marriage, one man, one woman, and then similar statements as you go down the line. This is, again, one party branding itself as the party of religion. Here's another example, again, from the great state of Ohio, direct mail flyer from 2004. This election is for families, a particular kind of family, reflected here in what may be the world's most beautiful family. I can't be certain. That might be Mitt Romney. It's might be. It could be. But notice you've got the dad, the mom, the beautiful kids. These people are so beautiful they don't even need shoes. They're just running through the field. You have this very nondescript building. Probably church, could be a synagogue, probably church. We don't know, Catholic Church, Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, we don't know. There's a church. And And we're told that strong families are the foundation of America, and that George W. Bush will recognize, protect, and support the family. Again, all examples of this kind of Republican branding that goes back a long way. That's why I want to show you some historical examples. Now let me show you a few campaign ads, again, of candidates using religion. I'm going to start with one from 2010, a politician that I'm guessing you probably haven't heard of. Her name is Pamela Gorman. She was running in Arizona in a Republican primary to represent her district in the House of Representatives. Watch and enjoy.
This year, a lot of folks think this is our best shot at changing Congress. Of course, that all depends on the caliber of our candidates. Meet Pamela Gorman, candidate for Congress in Arizona 3, conservative Christian, and a pretty fair shot. The insiders in the state Senate wanted to have her hide when she fought against their plan for higher taxes. But Gorman, she can take care of herself. Rated 100% by the NRA, conservative Pamela Gorman is always right on target.
I'm Pamela Gorman, and I approve this message.
Did you catch that she's a conservative Christian and a pretty fair shot? Because those two things obviously go together. Now, maybe this is unfair. You've never heard of Pamela Gorman, am I right? Since somebody's going to say, no, she's my aunt. Why are you picking on Pamela Gorman? I have no beef with Pamela Gorman. In fact, I'm very grateful for this ad. But I will admit, she's obscure, and she didn't even win a primary. So, who cares? Yeah, some candidate runs this one ad. It's funny, but doesn't really tell us anything. Well, here's another ad. This is from a politician I'm guessing you have heard of. Well, I'll just let you
Who
watch.
shares your values? President Obama used his health care plan to declare war on religion, forcing religious institutions to go against their faith. Mitt Romney believes that's wrong.
In 1979, the son of Poland, Pope John Paul II, spoke words that would bring down an empire. Be not afraid.
When religious freedom is threatened, who do you want to stand with?
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
So there's Romney using common language these days. He mentions religious freedom. That's become a very partisan issue. It used to be completely nonpartisan. Now religious freedom is sort of a freighted term. It's also, just as a little side note, interesting that a Mormon candidate appealing, at least in part, to evangelicals is highlighting his identification with a Catholic pope. We've come a long way, baby, from the way religious divisions used to operate in America. Maybe you were unaware of this, but it turns out Mitt Romney didn't win. He will probably win in Utah in a week and a half or so and represent Utah in the Senate. But he didn't win the presidency. You're all aware of that, of course. So again, maybe it's not fair, right? I mean, yeah, we see these ads, but what does that tell us about what's going on today? Well, here's somebody else. We are going to see, this is Ted Cruz, running in 2016.
Were it not for the transformative love of Jesus Christ, I would have been raised by a single mom without my father in the household. God's blessing has been on America from the very beginning of this nation. Over and over again, when we faced impossible odds, the American people rose to the challenge. This is our fight, and that is why I'm running for President of the United States.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
Pretty striking, isn't it, that the overtly religious language that he's using just sort of rolls naturally. I mean, you might say to yourself, well, okay, that's Ted Cruz, but Ted Cruz is sort of known as a religious right sort of candidate, and maybe he's not really representative of the mainstream of the Republican Party, if we can speak of the mainstream of the Republican Party anymore. So here's just one more ad, if you'll indulge me. This is now Marco Rubio, also running in 2016. And just as a reminder, while Ted Cruz is generally thought to be pretty far to the right, Marco Rubio less so. A Republican, certainly conservative, but really more from the center of the party, so more of a Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush, George W. Bush sort of Republican? Well, here's
Our goal is eternity, the ability to live alongside our Creator for all time, to accept the free gift of salvation offered to us by Jesus Christ. The struggle on a daily basis as a Christian is to remind ourselves of this. The purpose of our life is to cooperate with God's plan. To those who much has been given, much is expected. And we will be asked to account for that. Will your treasure stored up on earth or in heaven? And to me, I try to allow that to influence me in everything that I do. I'm Marco Rubio, and I approve of this message.
It's hard to know. Is he running an ad to become the pastor of your church? Running for the presidency of the United States? My point in showing you all of these is to reinforce that there has been a conscious effort on one side of the political spectrum to brand one party as the party of religion. And I could speak at great length, showing you evidence that it's been successful, but let me just talk about it for just a few seconds. If you ask people, just straight up, which party do you think is more likely to have religious people in it? Voters are far more likely to say the Republican Party. If you specify that you're talking about evangelicals, they're even more likely to say that it's the Republican Party. If you show campaign ads or describe a candidate, and that candidate uses religious language, but you never identify which party the candidate belongs to, voters overwhelmingly assume that that candidate is a Republican. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily accurate. There are lots of people of faith in the Democratic Party, and there are a lot of politicians running as Democrats, maybe even as third-party folks, who are also religious. But in the public mind, there has come to be this connection between religion and one party. Now, there's a name that I have not yet mentioned in this talk. Donald Trump. You can say a lot of things about Donald Trump. Hard to say that he's a religious right kind of guy. Probably don't need to detail exactly why I might say that. But one of the most stunning developments in American history in just the last few years has been the embrace of conservative religious folks, but perhaps mainly evangelical Christians, of Donald Trump. And this is just a quick slide to give you a taste of that. I actually love this picture. The Bible's upside down. I just had somebody point, I didn't even realize that when I made the slide, somebody pointed that out to me recently. But I don't have any ads to show you. Trump didn't actually run that many ads in 2016, but certainly there's a constituency in the United States that has embraced Donald Trump that a few years ago you probably wouldn't have expected. Now, why is that? Well, undoubtedly, it's because Donald Trump was running in the party that's identified with a particular brand of religion. But perhaps even more so, Donald Trump acts in a very transactional way with the religious right as a movement. Candidates like George W. Bush would say to evangelicals, vote for me because I'm one of you. I speak your language. And in their own way, John McCain and Mitt Romney attempted to do the same. Not always as successfully as George W. Bush, but nonetheless, that was the attempt they were making. Donald Trump has been a very different relationship with this constituency in the Republican Party. It's been very transactional. Vote for me because I'll bring you the things you want. I'll put justices on the Supreme Court that you like, that will vote the way you want. Vote for me and I'll move the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Vote for me and I'll loosen the tax restrictions placed on nonprofit organizations that are engaged in politics so that pastors can openly endorse candidates from the pulpit. It's become very transactional. And in return, evangelicals have embraced Donald Trump. So much so that they've changed their view of whether or not a politician's personal morality matters for their public behavior. This is a poll that was taken by the Public Religion Research Institute in partnership with the Brookings Institution back in 2011. They asked the question, can an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life? If you have an immoral private act, can they still act ethically in their public role? People can decide for themselves what's immoral. Among Americans as a whole, a little less than half, religiously unaffiliated. Most of them say, yeah, they can act ethically. Catholics a little less so. Evangelical Protestants, or specifically white evangelical Protestants, say, no way. That's probably what you'd expect, right? Many people in the room lived through the Clinton impeachment years in the 90s. This was the argument that was made. But I don't mean to pick on any one candidate, any one politician. This was sort of the thinking. This was the rhetoric. Fast forward to 2016. This is now the fall of 2016. Indeed, it is. This second poll was taken right after the release of the infamous Access Hollywood tape. I don't need to go into detail what was on that tape. You all know. And if you don't, you can Google it. But don't do it at work. And what do you find? Well, among the unaffiliated, a slight drop-off, and those saying you can act ethically. Among Catholics, there's an increase, and among white evangelical Protestants, a huge increase. Why is that? I would suggest that this is yet more evidence that many Americans are increasingly putting their politics ahead of their religion. And now I'm about to turn normative. Up until now, I've tried to keep things analytical, but I'm now going to get a little preachy. I thought it was okay, given this is Catholic thought and imagination. It is hard to think of a major social reform that has come over the course of American history that did not have religious roots. That includes the Civil Rights Movement, before that, abolitionism, but lots of other movements as well. Religion has not only been an engine of civic engagement, it has been an engine of social reform. And of course, one of the reasons that has been the case is that it has often been people of faith, religious leaders especially, who have acted and spoken prophetically to Americans. That's what we saw in the Civil Rights Movement. That's what we've seen in other periods in American history. Religious leaders have used religious rhetoric, which resonates very powerfully with many Americans, to make things better, to rise above the partisan fray. As we look ahead to the 2018 midterm elections here in a few days, as we look forward to the 2020 presidential election, as we just think about what's going on in our communities, in our states, and the nation as a whole, I really fear that we are either quickly approaching, maybe we haven't already had, a period in which religion has become corrupted and devalued as that force for reform in American life, and I regret that. So as you, and maybe especially the undergraduates, as you think about the midterm elections, if you are a person of faith, I hope that you will think carefully about not how you should twist your religion to fit your politics, but the other way around. So here's what I want you to remember from this talk. As I've said, religion is a major driver of civic engagement. However, civic engagement is not limited to religious folks, secular folks as well are civic engaged. And whether you in this audience are religious or not, I would encourage you to get out and vote. Whether it's by physically appearing at the polls or mailing in a ballot, get out and vote. And I also hope you'll take from this my word of warning, that when religious believers put politics ahead of religion, they risk at least three things. They risk betraying their own principles. They risk ceasing to speak prophetically. And thirdly, they risk creating, or maybe we might even say, continuing the backlash against religion that I have described thus far. All of which is a sobering note on which to end, but I don't want to leave people on a down note, so let me just return which is game 3 tonight. Go Sox. Thank you very much.
So we've got time for some questions. I've got a mic that I can pass around if people are not sure if they can project. So, great.
Hi, I have two questions. The first is, what do you think students, specifically undergrad, students' role in the upcoming midterm elections, or what do you want to say to students who are unmotivated to vote or conflicted by religion or mass media or whatever?
Well, my bottom line message is that they should vote, but that's kind of a cheesy thing to say. I think that we are living at a time where, and I mean this in all sincerity, where liberal democracy as we know it is under attack. I don't think we're at the point of no return, but I do fear that we have uncovered over the last few years a sentiment among a frighteningly large share of the American population who seem willing to dismiss the importance of democratic norms. The only way to counter those attacks on democratic norms is to ensure that the people's voice is heard. It's really remarkable that we have a system in which a president who receives a minority of the votes ends up in the White House, and that a party that has only a minority share of support in the country can nonetheless end up in power. And I don't say that as a partisan thing. I really want to emphasize that if the people's voices are to be heard, the people need to show up at the polls. Other forms of political activity are important too, but the vote is fundamental. That's what politicians listen to. And so young people need to keep that in mind. Even though there are lots of obstacles in the way, life's kind of complicated, and voting seems kind of complicated, and what am I going to do with all this? It's worth the effort to cast the ballot. Even if you live in a state, and I know this is less the case in California than where I live in Indiana, even if you're in a state that's increasingly making it more difficult for you to vote, that's maybe all the more reason to stick it to the man and vote. Now, for those who are of faith and are trying to make sense of the political world because they feel conflicted, that is not an uncommon situation. And about all you can do is say, I'm going to be engaged and I'm going to do the best I can to make the choice between these candidates. And if you don't like the choices that you're offered, well, that suggests that you need to get involved earlier in the process to ensure that the choices that you're offered reflect your own views. Yes? Oh, do you want to call on people? Should I?
No, either way, fine.
So you were mentioning that you saw Donald Trump's relation with evangelicals as transactional. And I've heard a lot of explanations of why people voted for Donald Trump that are the variety of, well, they sort of held their nose and did it because they wanted X. That doesn't feel right to me. I sense a tremendous enthusiasm for Donald Trump among his supporters. When I've spoken with evangelicals who support him, and they don't seem embarrassed or, well, you know, I got this out of it, so I held my nose and voted for him. How confident are you that it's purely transactional? It feels to me, unscientifically of course, as though they've really embraced him.
Yeah. Well, I actually am not going to deny that there has been an active embrace. I think that is true. But there are sort of two things going on here. So first of all, we have the question of how it is that Trump won the nomination in the first place of his party. And that's where we saw the great shift. You know, initially there were many evangelicals who were not enamored of Trump. Some were not. And then eventually they sort of swung behind him. And why did they do that? Well, that's my story about the tight connection between religion, at least religion of a certain stripe, and the Republican Party. That is, Trump has become the Republican standard bearer and sucks all of the political oxygen out of the room and becomes the figure for the Republican Party. It makes sense that those who are themselves deeply committed to the Republican Party would in turn become enthusiastic towards Trump. And in addition to that, we know that Trump is very good at using rhetoric that can really motivate people by touching them with these, sort of core issues. Why is the caravan that's going to invade the United States or something? Why are we hearing all about that? Because it speaks to these sort of core concerns. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing process. So he becomes the leader, speaks this language, you become more enthusiastic, he says more and more of it, he's more your guy, you become yet more enthusiastic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We actually see that with other politicians too. Barack Obama when he was first nominated, remember in 2008, was in a very tight race with Hillary Clinton. But upon becoming the standard bearer of the party, then became much beloved. And I can say the same for lots of other politicians. So I don't disagree that there has been an active embrace, but I think it's been a process over time, and it's tied as much to the politics of what's going on as it is to just Donald Trump as an individual. Yes?
You know, in California, since it's a liberal, here we are in liberal California, and so some of the younger folk, which I am not one, think, well, what does it matter? I mean, you know, our X number of votes are going to go Democratic anyway.
Yes.
But it wasn't always like that. I grew up behind the Orange Curtain in Orange County, and it was certainly a huge number of people in California who were very, very, very conservative. So do you think that young people should try and remember that it might not always be, you know,
if there is
political?
any lesson that young people who I'm willing to venture often lean a little to the left, probably would prefer not to have the current president that we do. If they need any reminder of why one should not be complacent in an election, remember election night 2016, when all of us, and I will admit, myself included, were confident that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And why didn't she? Because of very close margins in critical states. Now, you may not live in one of those critical states. You may not live in a critical district. It's still important for you to vote. And this is the political sciencey side of me. And the reason for that is if you start voting when you're young, you will continue voting when you're old. It's very much a habit. And if there's a lot of evidence that if you don't get in the habit when you're young, you're not going to develop the habit when you get old. And so it matters for you to start voting now because you're not always likely to live in an enclave of like-minded people. You might end up moving, I don't know, to Indiana. And so that's why I think that people should be thinking not just about this election, but what does my participation in this election mean for my future participation going forward? Dr. Parrish.
Hey, how do attitudes about race and gender figure into this story when we're talking about religion? I mean, we haven't talked about that a lot in what you've covered so far, but I mean, we know that was, at least always a constant subtext, and in many cases a lot more than a subtext in the 2016 election and conversations since then. How is that related to what's happening in Trump?
Well, you mean specifically with the religious right crowd?
I do.
One of the hazards of doing the kind of social science I do, which is to try to predict why people vote the way they do, or why they do or don't get involved in politics, is that we always want to identify the one thing. So I'm a religion guy, and so I want to say it's religion. And the race people want to say it's race. And the gender people want to say it's gender. But the reality, of course, is a lot messier than that, because those things are all clustered together. And when it comes to conservative religious folks, they also often have fairly conservative views on both race and gender. But, and this is what's interesting, perhaps not as much as you might think. So remember I was earlier describing the passively secular folks? If you compare the passively secular folks to the highly religious folks, who are all within the right, these are all Trump supporters, it's actually the passively secular folks, the civic dropouts, who are the more likely to have the views that I think you're getting at. The more traditionalist views, if you will, about gender roles and more concerned about race. In fact, there is some evidence, I wouldn't say this is a settled law, but there is some evidence that being involved in a religious community, even a conservative religious community, actually leads to more tolerance on racial questions. Not so much on gender, but on racial questions. So within Trump's coalition, you have a lot of these passively secular people. This is sort of the alienated, this is sort of the prototypical alienated Trump guy who comes to the rallies. These are people who generally hold very, very choosing my words carefully, traditional views on the issues of choose. Let's go here and then.
You mentioned that people with high levels of religiosity are highly civically engaged because of their communities. You also mentioned how people who are actively secular are also highly civically engaged. Do you think that they also have communities that allow them to become civically engaged, or do you think it happens some other way for those people?
That is a good question. Right now, so not looking forward to the future, but the way things are right now, it would mostly be through other channels. And I say that because we don't have a lot of evidence that secular people form the same kinds of communities as religious people do. Now, if you're a highly secular person, chances are a lot of your friends are also highly secular. But you're not friends with them because they're highly secular. You've come to be friends through some other way. You share some interests, perhaps, or went to school together, or those sorts of things. Whereas in a religious community, often, you've come together because of your shared beliefs. A lot of it is actually education. A lot of secular people are highly educated, and so that's something that kind of drives their civic involvement. But the point I was making is, I wonder, and this is just speculation, but I wonder if we might not see a change in that secular population as they grow and become more of a presence, and as they become more politically aware of themselves as a constituency. You might say, wow, what are you talking about? If I was giving this talk back in 1970-ish, 75-ish, I may have been describing this amorphous group of religious people who are Protestants, and they go by lots of different terms. Some call them fundamentalists, and some call them evangelicals, and sometimes they're just identified by their denomination, they're Baptists, Pentecostals, or whatever. And I might have suggested to you that at that time, that group was going to coalesce into a political constituency that would become very powerful in politics and very engaged. But it hadn't happened yet. It didn't happen until they were actively sought out by political entrepreneurs. And I would suggest that that's likely to happen with the secular population, and that can have a powerful effect on a common identity, which brings people together, which leads to more engagement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Basically, I'm telling you, 40-some years ago, there were people who predicted the rise of the religious right. Hats off to them. I'm here predicting that we're going to see the rise of the secular left. And if I'm right, you can invite me back and give me a prize. And if I'm wrong, we'll just all forget that this ever happened.
On that prediction, just because I know that the new class period is about to start and some students are going to have to take off, why don't you join me in thanking the speaker. So please join us for the other events I mentioned at the beginning. The flyers are outside. If you want to stay after, we've got a little bit of time to chat as well. But I just know that there's some students that were bobbing up and down in the seats getting ready